The cattle were the first sign something was different about Rolf Pedersen. Not the man himself. Rolf was unremarkable in most visible respects. A broad-shouldered Norwegian of 47, with a deliberate way of moving that his neighbors on the Sand Hills interpreted as slowness, and that was in fact the opposite. He had homesteaded his 160 acres on the north side of the Dismal River in the spring of 1876, and had built his sod house and his barn and his fence line with the systematic efficiency of a man working from a plan he had developed before he arrived, rather than improvising as he went. His cattle were unremarkable too. 12 shorthorn crosses, good winter beef animals, the same breed half the Sand Hills ranchers ran. What was different about his cattle was where they were in January. They were warm, not just sheltered, warm. When Bill Hartley rode over in the second week of January 1879 to check on Rolf after 3 days of blizzard had locked the Sand Hills under 2 feet of new snow on top of the existing pack, he had found Rolf's cattle standing in the barn, with their winter coats lying flat against their bodies, the way a cow's coat lies when the animal is comfortable, rather than raised and puffed, the way cattle raise their coats against serious cold. Hartley had put his hand on the nearest animal's back and felt the warmth coming off the hide, and had looked at the barn interior and had not been able to identify the heat source. He had asked Rolf about it that evening. Rolf had said the barn stayed warm on its own. He had said this with the flat delivery of a man stating a fact he considers unremarkable. And he had changed the subject to the condition of the Dismal River ice. And Hartley had let the subject change because he had not known quite what question to ask next. He had ridden home in the blizzard, thinking about warm cattle. What Rolf had built beneath his barn was not visible from the outside, and was not visible from the inside of the barn itself without knowing where to look. He had built it in August of 1878, over 6 weeks of work that he had scheduled deliberately for the driest month of the Sand Hills year, because dry ground was the only ground in which the construction method he was using would hold without water infiltration, compromising the result before winter arrived to test it. The construction had begun with a survey. Rolf had spent the first week of August walking the barn floor systematically, pressing a pointed iron rod into the packed earth at 1-foot intervals across the full floor area, reading the rod's resistance the way a man reads the resistance of a saw in green wood versus dried. By feel, by the difference in pressure required to advance the tool, by the sound the earth made when the rod entered it. He was mapping the subsoil composition. The Sand Hills of Nebraska sat on a geological formation of ancient wind-deposited sand over a dense clay hardpan that varied in depth from 18 inches to 4 feet, depending on location, where the sand layer was thin and the clay began early. The ground held its temperature more consistently than where the sand ran deep. He was looking for the thinnest sand layer in the barn floor. He found it in the barn's northwest corner. 22 inches of sand over a clay hardpan. Dense enough that the iron rod stopped cleanly at depth without the gradual resistance increase of mixed soil. A hard stop that told him the clay was consolidated and dry and would hold a cut wall without slumping. He marked the corner with a peg and went to the trading post in Brewster the following day and bought 40 feet of inch-thick pine planking, 2 kegs of cut nails, a roll of tar paper, and a quantity of dry sand he had specifically requested be kept under cover since the previous week. His neighbors saw the lumber in his wagon and asked what he was building. He said he was improving the barn floor. This was technically accurate. The neighbors accepted it with the mild interest that barn floor improvements generated in a community where barn floor improvements were not a remarkable category of activity, and Rolf drove home and unloaded the lumber and began digging. The dugout was 12 feet long by 8 feet wide by 6 feet deep, excavated from the barn's northwest corner with a short-handled spade. Working through the sand layer and into the clay hardpan, the clay coming out in dense, cohesive blocks that held their shape on the pile and did not crumble. He cut the walls vertical and square to within a half-inch of plumb, a precision that required checking with the spirit level he had brought from Norway in 1875, and that his Sand Hills neighbors would have considered excessive for a hole in the ground. The precision was not excessive. The precision was the point. Vertical walls transferred load cleanly to the clay floor below. Walls that belled or undercut transferred load to the sand layer above the clay, which would compress and shift and eventually bring the barn floor above down into the space. He lined the walls with tar paper, tacked to pine planking set vertically in the cut, the tar paper facing the earth to prevent moisture migration through the sand layer from reaching the interior airspace. He laid pine plank flooring over a 2-inch bed of the covered dry sand he had bought in Brewster, the sand acting as a leveling medium and a capillary break between the clay floor and the wood above it. He cut a trapdoor in the barn floor above, framed it with doubled pine headers that carried the load of whatever stood above it, cattle, wagon, the barn structure itself, and hung the door on iron hinges set into the framing with lag screws rather than cut nails, because the hinges would be operated daily, and lag screws held in repeated use where nails worked loose. He told no one it existed. By September, the dugout was complete, and the barn floor above it had been repacked with fresh earth that showed no sign of disturbance after 2 weeks of settling. The trap door, when closed, was invisible under a 1/4 inch of packed barn dirt that Rolf had applied with a trowel and tamped flat. He had built an access point that could not be found by someone who did not know it was there and was not looking for it. The Sand Hills delivered their first hard freeze on October 9th. Rolf opened the trap door that evening for the first time since September and climbed down into the dugout and sat on the pine plank floor and held a candle and looked at what the earth had been holding for him all summer. It was 51 degrees. 51 degrees was not an accident. Rolf had calculated it from first principles, the same way he had calculated everything about the dugout. Not from a book, because the book that addressed subterranean thermal behavior in Nebraska Sand Hill, clay formations, did not exist in any library he had access to, but from observation and arithmetic applied to what he had watched the earth do across 3 winters on the Sand Hills claim. He had noticed in his first winter that the sod house floor, which sat directly on packed earth without any wood subfloor, was always warmer than the air in the room above it when the outside temperature dropped below 0. He had pressed his palm flat on the floor in January of 1877 and held it there and felt the specific quality of warmth that comes from a material that has been holding heat for months against the cold above it and has not yet given all of it away. The earth below the frost line held heat. It held it slowly, releasing it across the winter at a rate so gradual that it was imperceptible day to day, but measurable across the season. A space enclosed within that earth, sealed against the outside air that would otherwise equalize its temperature, would hold the earth's stored warmth through the winter at a level determined by the depth of the enclosure and the thermal mass of the surrounding material. The Sand Hills clay hardpan, at 22 inches depth, held 51 degrees in October. By January, when the frost line above had driven the surface temperature to its seasonal minimum, the clay at that depth would have given up some of that stored heat. Rolf estimated it would settle at 44 to 46 degrees by February, based on the rate of decline he intended to measure and record across the winter. 44 degrees was not warm by any comfortable standard. It was 20 degrees warmer than a Sand Hills barn interior in a January blizzard, and 20 degrees was the difference between cattle standing with their coats flat and cattle burning body fat to maintain core temperature against an environment that was pulling it away faster than they could produce it. He spent October finishing what the summer had started. The dugout needed a heat source for human occupation in the coldest months. The earth temperature alone would sustain the cattle through the barn floor above, the radiant warmth conducting upward through the plank subfloor and into the barn air in a quantity sufficient to raise the barn ambient by the margin he needed. But Rolf intended to use the dugout himself through the worst of the winter, and 44 degrees required supplementation for sustained human habitation at the level of activity a working man maintained. He built a small clay firebox against the dugout's south wall. Not a stove. He had no iron to spare and no way to vent a standard stovepipe through 6 feet of earth and 2 feet of sand and a barn floor without creating a structural penetration that would compromise the barn floor's load-bearing integrity above. What he built was a clay and fieldstone firebox, 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep. Set into a shallow recess, he cut in the south clay wall, with a horizontal flue channel running through the wall itself and exiting through the barn's south foundation at ground level on the exterior face. The channel was 4 inches square, cut through the clay with a narrow spade and lined with flat fieldstone pieces that Rolf had dressed to a consistent thickness with a hammer and chisel over 3 evenings. The draft worked by the same principle as a standard chimney. Combustion gases rose and pulled fresh air behind them, but ran horizontally rather than vertically for the first 4 feet before angling upward through the barn foundation to exit at ground level on the south face. The angle was critical. Too shallow, and the gases would not rise with sufficient velocity to maintain draw. Too steep, and the channel would require a vertical section through the barn floor that created the structural problem he was trying to avoid. He had calculated the angle at 14 degrees from horizontal and had cut it at 14 degrees using the spirit level and a wooden wedge of known dimensions as a guide. He tested the draft in the second week of October with a small fire of dry grass and watched the smoke behavior for 40 minutes. The draw established itself in 6 minutes and held without adjustment through the full test period. No smoke entered the dugout interior. The channel was working. Bill Hartley came by in the third week of October with a question about fence line placement on the north boundary and found Rolf stacking cordwood against the barn's exterior south wall in a configuration that put the wood directly above the flue channel exit point. Hartley looked at the stack and looked at the barn foundation and looked at Rolf and said the wood placement was going to block the drainage away from the foundation if the spring melt ran heavy. Rolf said he would move it in March. Hartley said that was leaving it late. He said a man who let water sit against a foundation through February was asking for heaving come spring. He said this with the authority of a man who had been homesteading the Sand Hills for 8 years and considered foundation drainage a settled subject. Rolf said he understood the concern. Hartley rode off satisfied that he had contributed useful information, and Rolf went back to stacking cordwood over the flue channel exit and did not move it in March and did not have a foundation problem because the cordwood was not blocking drainage. It was concealing a 4-inch square hole in the barn foundation that he did not want Bill Hartley to ask questions about. The first real cold arrived on November 4th. The Sand Hills dropped to -8 overnight, with a northwest wind that had been building since the previous afternoon, and arrived at full strength between midnight and 2 in the morning, with the specific violence of a system that had crossed 500 miles of open plain with nothing to reduce its speed. Rolf woke at 2 to the sound of the wind at the sod house corners, and lay still for a moment doing the assessment he did every time a new weather event arrived. What was it? How long would it last? What did it require of him? He got up and went to the barn. The cattle were standing, not bunched against the east wall, the way cattle bunched when they were cold and seeking the mutual warmth of proximity. Standing individually in the loose formation of animals that are comfortable enough to maintain their own space. He put his hand on the nearest animal and felt the coat lying flat and the skin warmth beneath it, and looked at his breath in the lantern light. It clouded, as it would in any barn in a -8 night, but less than it clouded outside, measurably less. He opened the trapdoor and climbed down into the dugout. The clay firebox had been burning since the previous evening on a load of split cottonwood he had put in before dark, and the firebox walls had absorbed 6 hours of combustion heat and were radiating it back into the dugout air at the slow, sustained rate of dense material releasing stored energy. The dugout temperature was 53 degrees. Above the frost line, the sand hills were at -8. In the 6 feet of clay between those two numbers, the winter was working at the thermal mass Rolf had put his trust in, and the thermal mass was holding. He sat on the pine plank floor with his back against the warm clay wall and ate the cold cornbread he had brought from the sod house and listened to the wind above him and did not feel it. Outside, Bill Hartley's barn was at -3 degrees and his cattle were bunched. The hardest winter the Sand Hills had recorded in 11 years arrived in January without preliminary announcement. It did not come as a single storm. It came as a sustained cold event, a high-pressure system that settled over the Nebraska plain in the first week of January and did not move for 19 days, holding the surface temperature between -18 and -26 across the full duration, with winds that stayed consistently out of the northwest at speeds that drove the existing snow into hard, consolidated drifts against every structure on the plain. No new precipitation, no storm in the conventional sense. Just 19 days of air so cold and dry that the moisture it pulled from exposed skin and exposed timber and exposed soil was visible as a fine crystalline haze at ground level, when the wind dropped briefly in the afternoons, before building again by evening. Rolf tracked it in a notebook. He had started the notebook in October when the dugout came into operational use, recording the outside temperature twice daily against the dugout temperature and the barn ambient, building a 3-column record that showed the differential across the season. With the precision his spirit level showed the plumb of a wall. By the first week of January, the record showed a consistent pattern. Outside temperature -18 to -26. Barn ambient 12 to 17 degrees above outside. Dugout temperature 41 to 44 degrees above outside. The clay hardpan was giving up its stored summer heat at a rate that matched his February projection within 2 degrees, which meant the system was performing on the number he had calculated in August, and the number was holding through the worst cold the Sand Hills had delivered in over a decade. His cattle had not lost a pound. He knew this not by weighing them, which was not practical in January, but by looking at them with the eye of a man who had been running cattle long enough to read body condition from hip prominence and coat behavior and the way an animal carried its neck. They were going into the worst cold of the winter in the same condition they had entered November, which meant they were not drawing on body reserves to maintain core temperature. which meant the barn's thermal environment was doing what it was supposed to do. Bill Hartley lost 3 cattle in the second week of January. He came by on the 14th to borrow Rolf's block and tackle for retrieving a wagon that had broken through the ice on the Dismal River. And he mentioned the cattle loss the way a man mentions a loss he has partially accepted, flatly, without dwelling on it, with the forward-facing practicality of someone who has decided that grief over livestock is a luxury the Sand Hills do not permit. He said the animals had been in the barn, but the barn had not held heat adequately through the sustained cold, and 2 had gone down in the night, and a 3rd had followed by morning. Rolf said he was sorry to hear it. Hartley looked at Rolf's barn for a moment. He had been looking at Rolf's barn at intervals since January, when his own cattle started showing the stress of sustained cold, the bunching, the raised coats, the reduced water consumption that told him the animals were conserving energy rather than thriving. Rolf's cattle, visible through the barn's open south-facing gap when Hartley passed on the Dismal River track, were not exhibiting any of those behaviors. They had not been exhibiting them all winter. Hartley was a man who noticed things, and who had been noticing this particular thing since November without finding an explanation that satisfied him. He asked Rolf directly what he was doing differently with the barn. Rolf looked at him for a moment. He had kept the dugout private for the same reason Willa Dodd and Marin Soul and every other person who builds something unconventional in a community that has opinions about unconventional things keeps it private. Not from secrecy for its own sake, but because a solution that is working does not benefit from interference. And interference on the Sand Hills took the form of advice from people who had not built the thing and did not understand it, but felt qualified to suggest modifications. The 19 days of -26 had expired that qualification. He took Hartley into the barn and showed him the trapdoor. Hartley stood at the open trapdoor, looking down into the dugout for a long time without speaking. He looked at the pine plank floor and the tar paper wall lining, and the clay firebox set into the south wall, and the horizontal flue channel angling through the foundation to its exterior exit behind the cordwood stack he had warned Rolf about in October. He looked at the notebook open on the pine plank floor beside the firebox, the 3 columns of temperature figures running down the page in Rolf's small, precise hand. He picked the notebook up and read 3 pages of entries without asking permission. Then he looked at the cordwood stacked over the exterior flue exit. He said that was why Rolf had put the wood there. Rolf said it was. Hartley set the notebook down and stood in the dugout with his hands in his coat pockets, and looked at the clay walls and felt the temperature difference between the air around him and the air in the barn above, and did the arithmetic that the 3-column notebook had already done more precisely than he could do it in his head. He asked how long it had taken to dig. Rolf said 6 weeks working evenings after the day's other work was done. He said the clay was the critical element. Sand would not hold a cut wall and would require timber shoring that changed the thermal behavior of the enclosure and reduced its effectiveness. He said the Sand Hills had clay hardpan at consistent depth across most of the valley floor, and that any homesteader willing to probe for it with an iron rod would find it within 22 inches of the surface on the north-facing slopes, where the sand layer was thinnest. Hartley asked if he could bring his son out to see the construction before he started his own. Rolf said Saturday was acceptable. Hartley came Saturday with his son and his brother-in-law, Cord Fenner, from the claim 2 miles east, neither of whom Rolf had invited, but both of whom he had anticipated, because that was how information moved in the Sand Hills, and anticipating it was more efficient than resisting it. He showed all 3 of them the trapdoor, the wall construction, the tar paper moisture barrier, the firebox, and the flue channel angle. He showed them the notebook and explained the 3-column methodology and the differential it had produced across the winter. He answered questions for 2 hours, standing in the dugout with the clay firebox warming the space around them, and the Sand Hills winter working at the barn structure, 6 feet above their heads, without reaching them. Cord Fenner asked why Rolf had not told anyone about it in August when he was building it. Rolf said he had told them what he was doing. He said he had told Bill Hartley he was improving the barn floor, which was accurate, and that Hartley had accepted the answer and ridden home, which suggested the answer had been sufficient at the time. Hartley had nothing to say to this. Fenner started digging in February, which was not the ideal month to break ground in the Sand Hills, but was the month he had available, and he had the dugout enclosed and lined before the March thaw softened the clay walls and required him to let the construction cure before loading it. He lost no cattle the following winter. Hartley lost none either, his own dugout completed in August, with his son doing half the digging, and Rolf answering questions twice weekly by the simple method of riding over when he saw Hartley's lantern burning late in the barn and offering observations that Hartley had learned to receive without the skepticism he had brought to the cordwood stack conversation in October. 4 Sand Hills homesteaders had dugouts beneath their barns by the winter of 1880. 8 had them by 1882. The construction method moved through the community the way practical solutions move in communities that have been sufficiently convinced, not as an idea endorsed by authority, but as a thing that worked, demonstrated by the cattle that came through the worst winters on the Sand Hills, in conditions that the notebook's 3 columns of figures documented with the precision Rolf's spirit level had brought to the original excavation. He kept the notebook through the winter of 1884, 6 years of temperature records in the same small, precise hand. The 3 columns running down page after page with the consistency of a man recording something he considers important enough to document and not important enough to discuss, unless someone asks. In the spring of 1885, he started a second notebook. The first column was the same, outside temperature twice daily. The second and third columns were new. He had been thinking about the water table behavior under the clay hardpan across 6 winters, and he had questions that the first notebook had not been designed to answer. He intended to answer them,